Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Dean Godson. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this, the 6th annual Colin Crampthorne Memorial Lecture. As many of you know, Colin is a very dear friend of Policy Exchange, of myself. He was Chief Constable of West Yorkshire at the time of the 7/7 bombings and handled that investigation along with his force with consummate skill. He was also last Deputy Chief Constable of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and then first Acting Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, in which capacity he presided over the so-called Stormont Gate investigation. He was a man who was often in the right place at the right time. He was a man of great goodness, of great modesty, of great integrity. We're honoured to be able to continue to perpetuate his memory in this name. And I'm delighted also tonight, as always, to welcome his widow Lynn, his sister Vicky, his oldest son Edward. Thank you for coming. Please join me in expressing support. Particularly appropriate that we should have our guest of honour tonight, which is one of the little-known facts about Colin Crampthorne's life and life of service was that he was a most enthusiastic Royal Marine Reservist. He won the McCarroll Prize for his contribution to the training of young cadets, and he was a great admirer of the United States Marine Corps. And like yourself, General, he had many, many things in common with you. He was phenomenally well-read, had a vast library. I know that I've been told by some of your friends and associates that you hate nothing more than praise. But despite that, I hope that you, and Colin hated praise as well, but I hope despite that, and bearing in mind the famous maxim of Sulla often attributed to yourself, no better friend, no worse enemy, I hope I won't make an enemy of you tonight if I laugh on the praise tonight. But Colin's reading was phenomenal, ranged the gamut from Bernard Lewis to C.S. Lewis. The Screwtape Letters on the nature of evil were a particular source of consolation to him after the events of 7/7 as he faced that challenge, simultaneously, of course, to having a very brutal programme of treatment for cancer. And of course, his life was an embodiment of courage in facing that disease. Colin was also very much given to sending out reading lists to his troops, to his policemen who were working for him, just as you are famous, General, for the vast reading list that you send out to those under your command at all levels. And indeed, he often cited to his men the case which the US Marine Corps, of course, has done so much to popularise in both its real and its mythological version, the concept of the strategic corporal. And he was always telling the policemen under his command in West Yorkshire in a challenging multicultural and multiracial environment after the events of 7/7 that not only was what they did affected by the actions of the ordinary British soldier in Iraq, but that what they themselves did could also reverberate around the world, and that they had to think of the consequences of their own decisions at the most grassroots and street level. He taught them to think big, and he taught those more senior not to neglect the critical details. I know he would have derived enormous pleasure from your visit here tonight. I know that he would have been a huge fan. I know also that he would have been a great admirer of your own career. Most people here will be familiar with the details of your career tonight. I'll just go through a few. As commander of the 1st Marine Division during Operation Iraqi Freedom, commanding 20,000 troops on a 500-mile march that took 17 days, as author, along with the key figure in the rewriting of the counterinsurgency manual, along with General Petraeus, most recently as commander of the US Joint Forces Command, operationalizing many of the things which you've thought about and written about so deeply over many years. Colin was a man of thought and a man of action. We know that you, General, will do his memory proud tonight, and that there is no one better fitted to do that. Thank you for coming. Thank you for doing your first public lecture as Centacom here for Policy Exchange, coming from this distance. We're honoured and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. You're still my friend, so we're in good shape here so far. But Dr. Fox, Mrs. Cramphorn, Vicki, Edward, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege for me to stand here this evening and contribute a few words from my perspective. Forgive me, but I started working on this speech about 10 days ago and some things changed in the interim. But I thought I would continue with my remarks with two basic directions. One about our relationship between our forces, and the other about where we're conducting active operations together, and then we can open it up during questions and answers, perhaps some of the more current events. I never, as you understand, had the privilege of meeting Chief Constable Colin Cramphorn, yet despite that I sensed the kinship with him that Dean spoke to. In his service to his fellow countrymen and as a member of the Royal Marine Reserve, there's a saying we have in the U.S. Marines that once a Marine, always a Marine. It's kind of like Hotel California. Once you check in, you can't check out. So I sensed my brother-in-arms presence here tonight, as well, I might add, is his keen oversight in determining whether or not those of us carrying leadership responsibility today in the morally bruising environments that we are in, whether or not we can maintain our ethical balance, the kind of ethical balance he maintained after 7/7 in West Yorkshire. And really, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Fox, all of you, thank you for having me here after some of my public statements. Well, frankly, it's an honor to be invited in any polite company to speak at. But I can never come to this storied city without a deep sense of gratitude, for I've fought many times alongside your superbly competent and wonderfully high-spirited troops, who are always at their best when things look their worst. So while I want to touch on several issues this evening in my intent to prime the pump for the best part, the question and answer period, I wish also to speak for a moment to the special relevance of the special relationship between our two countries. I believe it is not an historic artifact. It's rather a source of strength for two nations committed to the survival of the values that grew out of the Enlightenment, values given voice in the literature, founding documents, and the traditions of our democracies. It's no surprise that the enemies of freedom have targeted both our nations, even as they've targeted others, from France to India, from the Philippines to Spain, from Bali to Oman, and the list goes on and on to Russia, Turkey. I can go on, you understand. For so many reasons, our two nations are seen as bulwarks against the maniacs who think that by hurting us, they can scare us. But clearly, they don't understand us. To paraphrase one of your former wartime leaders, as descendants of Alamein and Normandy, of Iwo Jima, and 100 other tyrant challenges, we are not made of cotton candy. And now to directly quote that leader, Winston Churchill, he said, "We have learned that we must live as men and women, not as ostriches, to be citizens of the world, members of the human community." And as Emerson said, that the only way to have a friend is to be one. This characterizes our relationship as courageous friends. There was a time in 1940 when you stood without us against tyranny, and this city lost many of its citizens. That changed with the attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. And despite the death and destruction wrought from that day, Churchill was silently relieved. "No American will think it wrong of me," he said, "if I proclaim that to have the U.S. at our side was to me the greatest joy. And I say ditto when I saw UK troops beside me in various battles that I have fought. The bonds of friendship and respect between our two nations are strengthened, not diminished, by the strains we have withstood this last decade. Today we stand together, and we must not take the special relationship for granted. A healthy relationship takes vision, a strong spirit of collaboration, and energy. But our relationship grows geometrically in strength with the commitment we make and the mutual respect we share in trying times. Our democracies have the power of inspiration, inspiring by our very existence those citizens of the world, to use Churchill's words, who desire freedom, while standing up to those who fear freedom and insist on coercion, tyranny, oppression, and terror. And while some historians have noted America's influence over the recent years, it is this geographically small island nation's significant role that is as refreshing as it is remarkable. People from around the world continue to flock here for Britain's opportunity, its values, its example, and dare I say, for its freedoms. In my line of work, however, I have benefited from those Englishmen who have gone the opposite direction. Those who left these peaceful, familiar surroundings and went abroad, some in the service of the Crown, some for the spirit of adventure that characterizes the best and brightest of Britain. Britain's reach gives its citizens, and therefore the rest of us, an appreciation of the world and how interconnected it is. In my current role as Commander of U.S. Central Command, which covers 20 countries from Lebanon to Pakistan, from Central Asia to the Bab el-Mandab, I have learned a great deal from the travels and writings of so many British diplomats and soldiers, and the likes of George MacDonald Fraser, Gertrude Bell, T.E. Lawrence, Peter Hopker, and a host of others passing on their experience and their timeless lessons. The British have for generations helped translate the world for the rest of us. Some of their work is as insightful and relevant today as it was decades ago. Today we continue to benefit from British perspective of the broader Middle East and Central Asia, where your diplomats and traders have spent generations. Even today when the fragility of the region is seen in demonstrations from Tunisia to Egypt and beyond, the US and UK share interest in stability and embracing the human potential. It is too early to tell what the results of the events in Egypt and elsewhere will be, but we are hopeful that the outcome will meet the aspirations of the Egyptian people. And speaking personally, as part of a military that has had a long relationship with the Egyptian military, we are proud that they are seeking to maintain order while respecting the rights of the people to express their opinions, keeping the affections of the Egyptian people. We are living in a transition period, and transitions often take longer, and they are less smooth than many desire. Part of that may be an unrealistic demand for instant change, a phenomenon emphasized by globalization and the speed of mass media. But in one case in my region, change is taking place before our eyes, albeit slowly, but in a positive way. In Iraq, a nascent, broadly inclusive government with power-sharing structures is forming and building the future. The Iraqi security forces performed admirably, largely protecting the Iraqi population during a drawn-out government formation process, the results of a very close election. Their performance will allow us to continue to draw down our forces while training the Iraqi forces who have been in the lead for months on all security duties. Around the Gulf and in Central Asia, we are working with partners in regional security efforts. From knitting together bilateral ballistic missile defense to maritime counter-piracy teamwork, we remain relentlessly engaged with friends and partners committed to a better future. At the same time, there are those that seek to use messages of intolerance and division to undermine efforts to establish long-term peace and prosperity, threaten security, and pursue destabilizing activities. Indeed, Iran presents the greatest long-term challenge in the region, as it continues to threaten regional and global stability. Despite the promise of its rich cultural heritage and educated populace, the Iranian regime continues to ignore the true aspirations of its people and appears less interested in hiding its ambitions to pursue a nuclear weapons capability, heightening global concerns over nuclear arms race that would destabilize the region. We are also closely watching the Middle East peace process. And while Israel is not in my assigned region, the peace process outcome greatly affects the entire Middle East. The peace process holds so many hopes, despite the many times peace sought by so many has eluded us. President Obama has made Israeli-Palestinian peace a priority from his first days in office, but the challenges are severe and only outweighed by the consequences for all of us if good people on both sides cannot achieve common ground. On all of these issues and more, we work purposely alongside our British counterparts. It has been said that nations have interests, not friends. The Anglo-American partnership is more than mere interest. The noted British historian John Keegan has said, quote, "Alliances are compromises in self-interest." But some alliances are less self-interested than others. The UK-US alliance is one of the least self-interested. That is especially true of our soldiers. After decades of working together and 10 years in our most current fight, British and American troops blend together on the battlefield with unspoken ease and trust. We should stop and take note of that. This military-to-military bond really is the special relationship. There is no greater compliment that a U.S. military man can give to a comrade than "I want him in the fight alongside me." For the U.S., we always want the Brits in the fight alongside us, which is where we find ourselves tonight while we enjoy this pleasant evening in gracious company in London. Let me move from these words of shared trust to their true meaning in southern Afghanistan, where your lads and ours are fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Afghan forces in the largest wartime coalition in most of our lifetimes, 49 nations, having grown by a half dozen this last year alone. And I must pass the respect and sympathies we in the U.S. military feel for the 350 UK families who have lost their loved ones fighting in the finest traditions of your forces, 100 of them having died in 2010 alone. We are very sorry for the loss. In key areas in Afghanistan, the enemy is disoriented and on the defensive, but we are not waiting to see if they revive. Last month, the U.S. approved more than 1,000 U.S. Marine reinforcements to join the fight and aggressively go after the enemy. Recognizing the key terrain where your troops fight in the Southwest, these reinforcements were committed to adjacent battle space there on your troops' flank. We have no illusions. This is a violent and cowardly enemy. When we face an enemy who bombs a local bus, as happened in Helmand a few weeks ago, killing Afghans, including innocent women and children, we must steel ourselves every day for more of their obscene brutality. There will be very tough fighting ahead. The casualties among our forces and the innocent Afghans have been heart-wrenching, yet the security progress is undeniable. That fact, that progress and violence can and do coexist in Afghanistan, is sometimes difficult to understand for those who have never fought. War is rarely a linear activity. War does not lend itself to neat and predictable templates. While the Afghan security forces and our troops must continue to fight in parts of Afghanistan, it is possible to wander along market stalls in Nawa, to see the results of immunization programs in healthy children, to drive roads now secure, to see boys and girls going to school, and even more remarkable, we have started to work alongside former Taliban who have come to the Afghan government's side. I personally talked to some of these former fighters in the mountains near Mazar-e-Sharif several months ago. They were both relieved and motivated by their choice to come over to the winning side, and on such small matters do larger results often depend. With a focused strategy now fully resourced over these last 18 to 20 months, with the Afghan Army's quality standards now catching up with its impressive numeric increase, with an enemy's bankrupt philosophy leaving them vulnerable wherever our troops hold the ground, there is progress. We recognize that an agrarian society, which was upended by the Soviet invasion 30-odd years ago, left enormous challenges in its wake. But the most positive reports I receive, ladies and gentlemen, come from the young non-commissioned officers and junior officers we have on the ground and in contact with the Afghan people. And there is a message in that reality that positive reports are routine from our troops enmeshed tightly in this war among the people. 2 weeks ago, the Afghan parliament was seated. Like the Kabul conference of last July, which was attended by dozens of foreign ministers, the insurgents swore to attack and make the city untenable for these meetings, both times. Both times the enemy failed, and Kabul, you must remember, is largely secured by Afghan forces. Enemy strongholds in Kandahar and Helmand provinces, long held by the Taliban when we simply had insufficient forces to protect the population in the south, have now fallen to the unrelenting offensives by our forces. 2010 was a very bad year for our enemies, and in 2011 we will unleash additional havoc on them. But the fighting, even for ISAF, will be tough. We do have more troops in the field engaging and hounding the enemy as we focus on protecting the Afghan people, and a mild winter this winter permits continued fighting now in this, the off-season. While there is talk of an adaptive enemy, and the enemy is adaptive, we are adapting faster and from a stronger basis. The Afghan Local Police Initiative, which permits government control and support for local village defense forces, promises a very difficult time for Taliban forces trying to re-infiltrate into areas where they once operated freely. Yes, the insurgents will adapt. They will try to infiltrate the Afghan National Security Forces, and they will try to undercut the national reconciliation efforts. And certainly the insurgents' indiscriminate weapon of choice, the IED, will cost our combatants and innocents alike in this war. Yet in the security arena, the inexorable progress, spotty as it was last year, is drawing more firmly a protective shield in more places. In the words of General Nick Carter, who said several months ago when I met with him in Afghanistan, we have regained the initiative. The enemy finds himself on the horns of a dilemma, to stay and fight or hide and wait. The NATO commitment to this mission until the targeted date to transfer security responsibilities to the Afghans in 2014 commits the transition process to a goal. Like I said, Kabul is already largely under Afghan control now and achieving impressive results. And as President Obama said in his West Point speech in December of 2009, we will start the conditions-based transition process in July of this year. With our increased operational tempo, both counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, the expanding village stability operations, and increasing confidence among Afghan people in their future, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are under the most significant pressure since 2001, and we intend to keep it that way. As Al-Qaeda in the borderlands has gone to ground, even as the quantity and quality of the Afghan National Security Forces has grown exponentially. Having lost their Afghan safe havens, they have used indiscriminate attacks in order to create a sense of general insecurity. Yet these attacks do not endear them to the local people, and that is a fatal mistake in a war fought among the people, and in which the hearts of the people are the ultimate prize. And often in war, it's who makes the fewest mistakes that wins. Our successes are more than transient, but they are not yet irreversible. The Taliban will try to reverse our momentum and regain lost ground and control over the population, and they cannot match our troops, whose ferocity in the close fight is matched by their ethical use of force, so different from the enemy. To sum up the campaign, ISAF and our Afghan partners will expand our efforts to protect the population in the key districts. We will support the growth of an effective Afghan National Security Force, focusing now on leader development and countering enemy infiltration into its ranks. ISAF and our Afghan partners will neutralize the insurgent networks that are fighting us as we disrupt, dismantle, and defeat Al-Qaeda and its associated movements, while our Afghan and international forces support legitimate governance and economic development assisted by the international community. And to refer back to the special relationship, we are united once again, united in the blood, sweat, and tears of a common cause against a shared enemy, as once again UK and US troops fight confidently alongside each other, once again against the heart of the enemy resistance in the south. Together once again against a medieval enemy who would deny human rights. In Kandahar, January 2002, shortly after 9/11, 5 years before that, for 5 straight years under Taliban rule, no girls had gone to school. On the day schools were opened, I stood and watched as hundreds of boys and girls poured into the streets on their way to school, walking confidently down streets where anti-Taliban Afghans and US Marines stood side by side, and starting an education revolution against the ignorance exalted by the Taliban. So let us not forget that we are engaged in a noble cause and keep heart. For to protect these experiments that you and I call democracy, we need to remember that we were born free by accident, but that we live here in freedom by choice, yet we have a responsibility to pass on these freedoms intact to the next generation, and we must not fail to carry out that responsibility. And having seen the first Staffords and the Desert Rats of the 7th Armored Brigade up close in 1991 in Desert Storm, having served alongside the Desert Rats of the 7th Brigade yet again, and 16 Air Assault and 3 Commando Brigade in 1 UK Armored Division on Operation Kelly, even under the most daunting budget pressures confronting your military and of course ours, and as an outside observer, I can assure you that it is a delight if we must go into a brawl to do so alongside your competent, valiant troops. Britain has long been and shall remain a vital voice in the debate on how the international community will find solutions to conflict. As military men and those who devote themselves to security, we need to pay attention to these issues and give our best military advice, not because we aspire to be nation builders or because we want to expand our portfolio, but because those who have seen war and acts of terror must do all we can to prevent them. Our nations face difficult economic environments, and in both the U.S. and Britain, our governments are directing that defense spending must be part of the reassessment of resource allocation. As difficult as it may be to take cuts in the midst of a fight, embracing this effort obviously will help us prioritize our missions. The political leadership in both our countries recognizes that national security is fundamental to a free and prosperous society. Our role is to give our best military advice to defend our nations. That means we need to explain what we need to do the job because we know our nations can afford survival. Our leaders are pragmatists and can clearly see the threats. As President Obama said when accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, evil does exist in the world. We will not eradicate violent conflict. Nonviolence couldn't stop Hitler, and Al-Qaeda won't lay down arms by negotiation. Our civilian leaders have seen the enemy deliver evil from New York to Madrid to London to Mumbai, and recognize that our enemies are not backing down from their illogical violent aspirations. Responsible nations banding together as we see today in Afghanistan, in this the largest military coalition in recent history, need to use all the levers of power to protect themselves and those devoted to peace. But those levers must retain their power, as President Obama also noted. The belief that peace is desirable is rarely enough to achieve it. Colin, I understand, also recognized the nature of the enemy, acting to protect his patch, even while maintaining his ethical balance. I believe, Mrs. Crampton, that your husband stood for what is the best in all of us, and I hope that he would be proud of how our nations work together, always together, in our protection of the freedoms today. Thank you very much.
General Mattis has very kindly agreed to answer questions, and so if I can call upon the first questioner, don't know who it is. Only one house rule, no question too outrageous, you just have to identify yourself, your name and organisation. Gentleman there at the back.
Monocle magazine. You mentioned the most daunting budgetary pressures facing both your country and ours. Here we've started to work more with our European partners. Do you think that's the way that we should be going forward?
What was that? I missed the first sentence. So
in terms of the budget pressures, which you mentioned at the start, do you think that working together with our European partners is a sensible way forward?
Absolutely, I do. I think there's a reason why we have alliances like NATO still relevant today. And I think by working together, we help carry the load, bear the burden for the protection of these what I call experiments called democracies. Really, in history, we have seen this throughout history. You can see where Alexander the Great's army had cavalry from one place, archers from another. They drew on each other's strengths. I think today we see the same sort of thing going on. There are aspects of our logistic and intelligence supporting the American forces that we can share with others. But I think that there's a fundamental point to be made here, and that is when you want to collaborate with someone else, there is no bar to it. It comes down to you want to collaborate or don't you. A spirit of collaboration will overcome just about anything. And by working with others like this, whether you go back to Churchill's biography of Marlborough, or you look at Eisenhower's trials and tribulations, working from just down the street here, I think that always we find solutions when we work together that will elude us if we think one nation on its own can do anything in the security realm and gain a positive outcome. I salute what your leadership is doing right now. Thank you.
Gentleman in the second row.
Hi, General Mattis, good to see you again. My name is Connor Tucker. I'm from St. Anthony's College in Oxford. My question is about kinetic operations and transformation of the U.S. military. But what I really want to ask is how do we make sure that we're not fighting in the last war and the next war we get into? Specifically, when you think about or when you read what generals both in the UK military and the US military are saying about counterinsurgency, what you see is that they downplay kinetic operations and they overplay infrastructure and investment in host governments. And what I'm concerned about is the ability of the military to retain its ability to use kinetic coercive force to get political things across. Do you think it's time for a new type of agency that is like USAID that is beefed up to provide security for itself? Or do you think that as military forces, you can both prepare for a kinetic operation at the same time as you can prepare for an insurgency?
The quick answer is I think our forces can do both because of the quality and hopefully the intellectual leadership of the forces. And I say this having read recently that it took only 22,000 redcoats to hold the subcontinent during an earlier time. It was not done obviously purely by force of arms. There were other people working the civilian aspects, and the British Army provided security. But I think that you're hitting on a key point here. When I got back from Iraq the first time, I wasn't home but a month or two when I got the warning order to get the division ready, the 1st Marine Division ready to go back in. I brought a psychiatrist, psychologist, sociologist, very interesting professor down from a Southern California college to look at my unit. She knew nothing about the military. I brought her down because I wanted an outside view. I just sensed that as we still had ships at sea bringing our gear home, we were going to have to go straight back in. And I was more concerned with the human factors. She wandered around for a couple of weeks. She came back in and she said, have you ever heard of dramatic instance fallacy? I said, no, I haven't. I'm a Marine infantryman. What do you expect? And she said, well, General, she said, you have dramatic instance fallacy. She said, many of your young men have only been in one war, and they think all war is what they just saw. And she said, what they're going to do is they're going to take their worst day in that war, and in their mind, they're going to crank up the violence level, and you're going to have to be very, very careful, and a better process could not have been there as we work to maintain our ethical balance and turn the cycle of violence down in a very difficult place called Al-Anbar province, the Sunni Triangle, Fallujah, you know the rest of the story. And it takes me, it's a reminder that in this age, the American forces need the thinking out of the UK more than ever. And let me be very, very blunt here. The strategic thinking of the UK right now is one of the strongest arrows in the democracy's quiver. You know where I went, to Hugh Strachan at Oxford, for my strategic advice. You know that I went to Colin Gray at Reading University. There's a reason for this. It's a free market. I go where I can get the best ideas. And Colin Gray said something very, very interesting. He said, no military today can afford to adopt a single preclusive view of war because an enemy naturally gravitates toward your area of perceived weakness. We are going to have to maintain a training program that allows us to fight across the spectrum, because if we leave part of it empty, that's the part the enemy will move to. And in this regard, the best thing that in the U.S. forces can do, I don't believe your forces need advice from me. The best thing the U.S. forces can do is make certain we give sufficient dwell time to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and the Commandant of the Marine Corps that they can train their people for more than just the next rotation going out 7 months later. Many of our forces, you know, are on 12 and 12 or 7 and 7, and have been in that tempo now for going on 7, 8 years. So your question goes to the very heart, I think, of how we make sure we're not fighting the last war as we make certain we can protect these democracies. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Gentleman, name
David Lancaster. General, one word has not been used by you tonight. That is Pakistan. And yet we all know that Pakistan is the world center of terrorist activity. In preparation for this interview tonight, I thought I would acquire Bruce Riedel's book on the search for Al-Qaeda, because I believe that within 4 months of him publishing the book, the President asked him to draft the strategy, which has been followed in CENTCOM area, I understand. It is a fascinating analysis of the involvement of Pakistan with Al-Qaeda, with terrorism. And when I came to the chapter on how to defeat Al-Qaeda, I was bitterly disappointed, because I thought it was rather a wish list of the United States must do a bit more to sort out Kashmir, and India, I'm sure, will go along with it. The United States must bear down a bit more heavily on all aspects of Pakistani terrorism. And General, we both our countries know that Pakistan, the ISI, the military, are actively supporting terrorism to a certain extent. And we are willing to tolerate that because we are afraid that if Pakistan falls, a government in Pakistan could be supporting terrorism to 100%. My question to you is this. Do you think it is time that we, in the back rooms of your command, you looked at another scenario which may be rather different from the one of nurturing Pakistan, hoping that one day they will do the right thing against terrorism? It may be getting closer to India, forcing Pakistan to look east, or maybe we may sort things out on the west. I am concerned that unless we address the issues in Pakistan, it may collapse in the next few months in any case, through its own internal pressures and corruption, or if it launches a terrorist attack, I understand you will hit 160 targets, and that will certainly bring down the government there.
Well, thank you. The sort of candor one expects when they come to London town. First, about your disappointment about the book. For those of you who have not read it, it lays out basically the threads of Al-Qaeda origins, how it comes to conduct the attacks, and then where do we go. I was not as disappointed because I think you remember, I think this first point is the first thing we must do is defeat Al-Qaeda's narrative. And I think that this is an area, because of the nature of this enemy, that has been very, very challenging for our political and military leaders in terms of explaining the type enemy we're up against and what we must do. But although it's heavy lifting intellectually, I think it is absolutely essential. So if we start with where Bruce Riedel takes us, I think it's still a good starting point. Is it complete? No, but the book is dated now, and I think we both accept that. As far as Pakistan, you know, what a tough neighborhood. You know, I'm not sure that I would want my country to be in that neighborhood and then have so many outsiders explaining what they're doing wrong. And I'm not poking fun at you at all. But my point is, if 3 years ago I told you, I think the Pakistani army will move 100,000 troops from the Indian border, put them into the high country, the most forbidding, difficult terrain I've ever operated in, granted on the Afghan side of the border, and sustain through a record snowfall a year ago, and over 3,000 casualties, many, interestingly enough, among their junior officers. I think someone would have been quite okay to laugh at me for saying that that would happen, right? I mean, who would have thought that would happen? That's exactly what happened. So as we look at what Pakistan has not done, as we look at the checkered past, as some people would call it, I think it's also important in terms of intellectual honesty to look at what they have done at great peril to themselves. It's no secret the United States helped arm some of those same organizations during the anti-Soviet campaign. And for a country that has, since its origins, been fixated on a threat from India, I think that we have seen perhaps even the democracies make common cause with some countries back in 1941 that perhaps did not share all of the same values we shared as we united against an enemy. So again, I would look at this, at what the Pakistan military has done. Its economic situation is certainly a challenge, to say the least. It is a very complex issue. There are many loose ends to the issue. But as always in history, it's not simply a linear process where one day it all goes a certain way. Very close to these shores were people who stood on another shore with binoculars and guided U-boats against their convoys. And we accepted that there were certain pressures on that country to provide that sort of support under an alleged neutrality. It's never clean, is my point as I look at history. But I would also say that when you look at the last 2 years and the thousands of dead, the Pakistan military is not standing idly by. And whether or not it's exactly as we would have it, well, the toughest thing in the world to do, the only thing tougher, according to Prime Minister Churchill, than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And I think that's where I come down on it. But it's a great question, and we wrestled.
Lady there, hang on a second.
Caroline Dominic, Henry Jackson Society. Gentlemen, thank you for speaking to us. I have 2 questions. The first concerns Afghanistan. You said in your speech that war is not linear and does not lend itself to predictable templates. And then you moved on to discuss President Obama's conditions-based transition process, which many of our enemies are reading as retreat. What psychological effect upon our opponents do you think a conditions-based transition process has? And my second question concerns the Lebanese armed forces. And would you agree that support for Lebanese armed forces is critical to the survival of Lebanon at the moment? And that the US, is the US waiting for the appointment of a new Minister of Defence to unfreeze that funding? And what effect do you think that the freezing of that funding has on the LAF and on its enemies in Hezbollah?
Thank you. As far as seeing the conditions-based as a retreat, I think it undercuts the enemy's narrative that we're there to occupy, take over for whatever reason, I can't imagine. But I think when you take the commitment by the President, by the U.S. President, to send in tens of thousands of reinforcements and commit our Treasury to the effort, add to it what happened in Lisbon as far as 2014, I think that having conditions-based withdrawal is also a way to refute the enemy line that somehow we're there to occupy this country forever. I think there is actually a strength to it. Militarily, I'm uncomfortable with it, as all military men are, with the uncertainty, the unpredictability of war. But we fight wars for a political reason. I hope we do. I hope we're not just fighting for the fun of it. And so I think there's actually a wisdom to refute the enemy lies about what this alliance is there to do. And so I'm not concerned about the approach we're taking there, so long as it's done in concert and transparency with the allies who also have their lads, their young folks in the fight. Does that address your first question sufficiently?
Yes, I was also wondering what effect that has on our opponents.
Well, on our opponents, I think to some degree it may, in the short term, give them heart. But, like I said, it undercuts their narrative, and in war, the moral level of war is more important than the tactical. And especially come August of this year, when they see we're still there, I think then it's going to have a double whammy effect on them, of really impacting on their morale, as they realize maybe their leaders were lying to them, the young troops, their troops who go into the fight, some of whom are coming over to our side. On the Lebanese armed forces, you know, in Lebanon, the military does not consider itself a political instrument. It really does not. I've been to Beirut very recently. I've talked with them, and does Lebanese Hezbollah have an intrusive effect throughout the society, a representative effect even in their military? Of course it does. But overall, the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese Hezbollah are very different organizations. And I go so far to say that we did not see any collaboration between them when they were actually conducting active operations here a couple of years ago. I think that a vacuum in the Middle East is not often filled by something that you and I are pleased with. And I think to continue to maintain a relationship with the Lebanese armed forces gives us a connection to the moderating forces in the society, the ones that are made up of, like their political system is supposed to be, of Sunni, Christian, and Shia. So I don't think it's a waste of money. I don't think it's feeding support for their country's Hezbollah. And we have never tracked, and we watch it pretty closely, any of the weapons or ordnance going from the Lebanese armed forces to Lebanese Hezbollah. Go ahead.
I don't want to take up more time.
No, go ahead, please.
My question was really about the fact that the Americans are cutting funding to the LAF, which is a beneficial thing, and that this is actually giving aid to their enemies, which will possibly aid the disintegration of them. But I don't want to...
Yeah, thank you. I was giving the rationale for what got us to here. I think that any time in transition period, it's healthy for political leadership to stop and do an audit of what you're doing. I think that that is a healthy thing to do. And I'll defer to my political leadership. Obviously, I'll give them my best military advice in private, which is how I always give my advice. But I think that they'll come to the right decision. But I think it's due diligence, frankly, to stop and take a look at it. Yes,
Gentleman there in the middle. Yeah, you.
David Strang from the Associated Press. General, what operational effects, if any, are we seeing from the instability in North Africa? Are there any plans to rearrange the forces or ships? And when contingency planning for any changes to force posture, equipment, deployment?
The short answer is no. These issues do not call for a military solution right now. I think many of us are watching the television, watching BBC, CNN every night, and reading hopefully your wisdom, young man, as we try to get our hands around what's going on. There's a lot of people talking about it. There's a couple of them that actually seem to know what they're talking about, and I try to focus on them. But there's no reason right now for any shift in military forces or anything like that. I've not received any orders. I've not requested or directed anything like that.
Later then, third row. You.
We talked quite a lot about the close relationship between the UK forces and the US forces. Are you disappointed, therefore, that our Prime Minister has attached a calendar-based deadline to the exit of UK combat troops from Afghanistan of 2015, as opposed to the position-based deadline set by your President?
Well, in a word, no. Out of Lisbon, it was a clear commitment, I think, that we're there. And as the security situation improves, as we anticipate it will, you'll see forces being drawn down at some point. Districts will not all improve at the same time. Some districts will improve or are already trending towards being transition districts. Others are going to be longer in getting there. And so to me, there's no incompatibility with this way ahead. It's consistent with the NATO strategy, the NATO political commitment, and I think we're on the right track with it. I don't find any tension, I guess, in the approach.
Gentleman there, second row.
General, through this period in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US has been operating with different rules of engagement from the British. Is your view that the US rules of engagement have been more effective and we've been fighting with one hand behind our backs, or that there's things to be said for our approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm probably not fully qualified to answer. I have talked to your troops in the field about the rules of engagement. I have not heard the kind of criticism that I sometimes read in the press, quoting some of your troops. I have talked to very young officers who are at the very front end, the NCOs who are as irreverent as mine are, and they've been very frank that if they need to fire, they know they can fire. There is this constant balancing act as you try to turn down the cycle of violence in counterinsurgency. And the line is not strictly drawn at one point in the campaign and held fast. No one nation has all the good ideas, even if they have the most aircraft carriers. And I think there's something to be said of questioning and adapting rules of engagement as the enemy adapts. And certainly as the enemy situation clarifies, you can go with a certain set of rules of engagement that perhaps you weren't able to avail earlier in a more confused, mixed up period. And then later on, the enemy in one area opens with a new effort, and so we look at whether or not we have to adapt our air-to-ground, for example, rules of engagement, that sort of thing. So I think that what you're really looking at is the adaptive nature, the chameleon aspect of warfare, and the adaptations that you expect military leaders to make so that our troops are always in a position to protect themselves and carry out the mission. But I probably am not the best because I've not laid them side by side. I've got anecdotal evidence from your troops and from our own, so I know where the frustrations are, and I can't attribute any back to yours. I've got a few of my own, we've addressed those, and we moved on.
Gentleman there, towards the middle, back yet you.
General Mike Curtis, wondering if there's any impact of the continuing resolution on your ability to operate.
Yeah. The continuing resolution, obviously an American, this one was decorated for valor over my head in 1991, not far from your troops, by the way. Good to see you, Mike, and thank you for that difficult day. The continuing resolution has no effect on me. As Central Command, bottom line is I am fully resourced, fully equipped. The people I get are fully trained. The units are fully ready to go. Obviously, it's a challenging thing for our budgeteers back in Washington, but no, it has no effect on me whatsoever. I'm fully resourced. Good to see you.
Gentleman at the back in the middle. Yeah. Name and organisation.
Thank you very much. Barry McCallum, I'm a local councillor, but just speaking for myself today. I was interested in how you spoke about the sort of flame of democracy, the sort of experiments that we had here in the US. And those of us who've been watching the news this week, it seems as though more and more people are discovering that and reaching out for that. Tunisia and sort of Egypt hopefully today, and now Jordan seems to be going down that path with the cabinet there being sacked today. It looks as though all of the sort of autocracies, the real hardline regimes throughout sort of North Africa and into the Middle East are under threat from the people actually wanting to have liberty. And that places surely Britain and America in a dangerous position, or a difficult position, because we've got alliances, we've got engagement with those governments that are now almost sort of being in the way of their people's desire for freedom, which is what we stand for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the gentlemen was telling me earlier what would it be about a prime minister. What's the most difficult aspect of being a prime minister? And he said, events, my boy, events. You know, life is one darn thing after another, you know. But going down that path, I'd almost say it's going up that path. I think too that there's nothing like the power of example of this Parliament, not far from where we sit, of the always turbulent U.S. political scene, to remind people where we all stand on aspirations of the people. I think none of us have been apologetic, neither of us have been apologetic, and none of our populations, political leaders, whatever, have been apologetic about where we stand on democracy. At the same time, you cannot drop democracy on people from 10,000 feet, something I think we all need to remember. And we have, each nation has its own pattern, its own history, its own culture. And for a U.S. Marine whose Corps thinks it's very old at 235 years, I'm probably ill-disposed to give advice to countries that have been around for 4,000. So I provide options for our president, military options, and it is up to our diplomats, I think, working within the UN Charter and doing the kind of things we expect from our political leaders. That's why we vote them in, to set that example without dictating, I think, outcomes. It's a balancing act, and frankly, that's why I'm in the Department of Defense and not the Department of State. That's the best answer I can give you. It is quite a time we live in, isn't it?
I saw a few more hands going up. Let's see. Gentleman there. Gentleman row. Yeah. You, yeah.
Jonathan McClory, Institute for Government. Gentlemen, just on your last point, I wonder if you could talk through the military reaction to the quadrennial diplomatic review that came out recently, so specifically around putting civilian control more central to the process of developing foreign policy and even conflict prevention.
So from our quadrennial defense review, whether or not we have that balance, right?
Diplomatic review, sorry.
Oh, the diplomatic review. I have not been part of it, and I'm very reluctant to comment on it, other than to say that the review itself, we've always looked at how the military does things. Should we not also look at the other aspects? There is a concern on the part of many of us in the U.S. military that we may have over-militarized some of our, or militarized, excuse me, some of our foreign policy. That's probably an unfair characterization, especially when you have a Secretary of State as articulate, forceful, and visionary as Secretary Clinton. I will tell you that between our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense, we have a very tight-woven team, and I think it resonates back and forth today, having the two teams working well together. We've got a degree of trust between us that's almost probably every bit as good as between the UK and US militaries right now, which is pretty phenomenal considering you haven't burned down Washington in at least a couple hundred years. I think it's the right thing to do, and it's a healthy thing when we go through it in the Department of Defense, and I have no doubt the Department of State will benefit from that audit, that review of where it's going.
Gentleman there.
That's the answer I can give you.
Jonathan Powell, General, you talked, I think, about defeating Taliban rather than degrading them. Do you think it is possible to defeat them by purely military means, or again, would it be necessary to talk to them and find a political solution?
Yeah, I think that insurgencies are never defeated by purely military means. It's got to be heavily political. There is a strong political component to the effort. The reconciliation effort obviously is Afghan-owned, Afghan-led. It's their country. They're the ones who are going to have to reconcile. But that's where setting the conditions are so important. 2 points to remember. One, you don't reconcile with your friends. So it means we're going to have to deal with some people who have been fighting us. But two, I think it's also important to remember that generally speaking, we're going to have to disabuse them of the hope that violence is going to work. And in an imperfect world, that means we're going to have to dominate them when we meet them tactically. That to me is a sad reality, because it's not insignificant when you send young men into a fight. But at the same time, it's going to take economic development, it's going to take governance from the bottom up and the top down. This is challenging. This is challenging work, but it's not impossible. And I think that by the way we do things in these countries, as fractious as our politics often are, it actually drives us towards solutions that are less kinetic, less lethal, and towards more holistic. So I'm very, very optimistic right now, and but I'm under no illusions about the challenge either.
A couple more questions, I think. Who do I see? Gentleman there. Hang on, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, just a thought from what you just mentioned, General. I just got back from Afghanistan. We talked about a holistic approach, but isn't the problem now that the Taliban as a movement is so fragmented? As you rightly said, they're being written down very severely tactically in the southwest, because they're going towards perhaps the side of the region, those of the southern. You've got Haqqani in the middle, who seem to be quite intractable and very much tied up with the ISI, and all kinds of new things emerging, according to General Petraeus' portrayal, in the east and north. So, I'm putting it to you, a grand reconciliation, a sort of Regional Congress of Berlin of Reconciliation is not available. How do you deal with a picture that is sort of rattling around, cracking like a kaleidoscope in front of you?
Yeah, I could not agree more strongly with your characterization of the fragmenting. But I think there is also opportunity there, especially when you look at the political reintegration. And talking to the young boys that I talked to up outside Mazar-e Sharif, had they been offered the opportunity, even years ago, to protect their villages, they would have taken it. You know the challenges that President Karzai has faced as he tries to put together a government on the fly with a murderous insurgency going on. And, you know, let's face it, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest that have been tried. It's not easy work. Even President Lincoln, during our Civil War, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the absolute bedrock of a democracy. And so this is not easy, but at the same time, if we can create these kind of, from the bottom up, I mentioned from the top down and the bottom up, if we can go from the bottom up and work in each town, all politics are local, not just in Peoria, Illinois, or Northampton, but also in Afghanistan. If we can start in each valley and each area where we can go in and protect the people and provide some kind of government services from a government that's learning how to do this, and little by little, we see more effective government officials going in. Now, there's a reason for it. We also pay them 3 times as much if they go through the schooling, and any organization gets the behavior it rewards, so we're starting to get the kind of behavior we want. Then I think that you can identify in each local area the right way to win them over. In many cases, because it's fragmented, they are also not as committed to a brainless ideology of people who raise children to be cannon fodder or suicide bombers. And so I see this as an opportunity, but it does mean you can't come down and say, all lieutenants and sergeants will do this all over Afghanistan. You're going to have to adapt. In one village, it's the governor who's the good guy in the district. Another one, it's the local police chief who's won the people's trust. And another one, it's nobody, and we're going to have to find someone. But I think that there are opportunities here if we go top down and bottom up and don't just try to drop it in from above.
Let's see any other questions. Sorry, for which organisation?
Sorry, Reuters. Would the US be militarily already instructions to Suez Canal?
Oh, you know I won't. You're from Reuters, you know I wouldn't take a hypothetical like that. But I mean, generally speaking, there's a motive for doing something, even if it's one that's hard, maybe a little illogical to look at. But when you look at the fiscal impact of that on whoever is in position of authority in Egypt, I just can't imagine the motive to shut that down. Were it to happen, obviously we would have to deal with it diplomatically, economically, militarily, whatever. But that to me is hypothetical, and I defer to the political leaders.
I think that's probably the last.
Thank you.
My great pleasure in conclusion to call upon Secretary of State for Defence, Dr. Liam Fox, to deliver those thanks. We've been trying to get you onto our platform for some time. Dr. Fox, we're glad it's on this occasion of all occasions. So thank you for coming, and we know that you'll express our appreciation to our guest of honour. Thank you.
Well, General, it's been a pleasure and an honour to have you at this very prestigious occasion, and very suitable that in an event that commemorates a man of great integrity, that we have a man of great integrity giving us your address this evening. You've always been a man who's been at the centre of the action, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq or Kuwait, which has given you, in the modern day, virtually unparalleled military experience, but perhaps more than that, a great cultural understanding of a part of the world that, as today's events have been showing, is shaping and reshaping itself, and possibly us as well. Therefore, there can be no one that we can have more confidence in being in charge of CENTCOM at the present time, and I know from having visited there how high is the regard in which you are held by those that you command. You're also, and have been, a great friend and partner for the United Kingdom. Your words about the professionalism of our armed forces and the losses that we have sustained in Afghanistan are not only greatly appreciated, but hugely reciprocated by all those who are here this evening. You mentioned Winston Churchill and the special relationship. And when Winston Churchill first talked about the special relationship at Fulton, Missouri, in, of course, the speech better remembered for his first use of the phrase, the Iron Curtain, he did so as a wartime leader. And his view of the special relationship was not, as I think it has sometimes become in the hijacked fashion of recent times, some Disney-esque emotional loving between our two countries. It was a hard-headed view of the importance of training, interoperability and intelligence between nations in wartime. And we need to remember that that is the bedrock of the special relationship, and we need to, I think, discourage some of those rather grander and I think less enduring qualities which are sometimes attributed to it. But integrity without courage would always be a great loss to public life. And General, when you have talked in sometimes controversial but brave way that you are renowned for doing about the fact that in America the federal deficit has become a strategic threat to the United States, the level of debt interest that the United States is paying to Moscow and Beijing. These are words which we have heeded greatly here in the United Kingdom, a country where our debt interest ourselves next year of £46 billion is beginning to dwarf our defence budget of £37 billion. And we do need to hear from some of the military leaders some of these warnings about the threats that our political life can lead us into. And I think that we, the politicians, need to heed and act upon those warnings. It's important because we need to get the balance right for our militaries. You do as well as we do. And when you were speaking, I was reflecting on the fact that when the Duke of York was preparing Britain for the threat of Napoleon between 1792 and 1804, he increased the size of the British Army from 50,000 to 500,000, and he did so with 38 helpers in horse guards. Today, we have an army of almost 100,000 and civil servants of over 82,500. And one wonders where that relationship went wrong and that ratio was upset over the years. We will do our bit on the political side, here and in the United States, where we are partners closer than any partners in the world, to ensure that you have what you need, militarily and in terms of the political space, to achieve what we both need to achieve in Afghanistan. We're enormously grateful for you coming tonight. One of the great things as an elected politician is that you get to bask in the reflected glory of others. And it's my pleasure and the whole of this audience to bask in yours this evening. Thank you very much indeed.